When you walk through downtown Marquette on a typical 21st century day, you'll see many areas where you can park your car. And those parking lots were once the home of some of the most interesting buildings in the history of the city. The core area of Marquette's downtown was built before the need for parking lots, so every single available space was filled with structures, businesses, homes, and office blocks. In the middle part of the 20th century, two things conspired to change this. One was the fast-growing concept of urban renewal, the thought that old buildings were lacking in everything from beauty to structural soundness and needed to be replaced with something new. The other was a change in the way that people made their way to work every day. As Marquette grew, many people no longer lived close enough to walk to work, and as the cars they drove became more prevalent, there was a need to put those vehicles somewhere. Together, those two events led to one of the biggest changes yet seen in downtown Marquette. You could spend hours walking around the area, staring at parking lots and wondering what used to be there. And that's kind of what we'll do in this expanded Pieces of the Past, filling in each and every downtown parking lot and putting the spotlight on a few of the iconic businesses and buildings that are no longer there. Ready? The entire northwest corner of Washington and 4th Streets is now one of downtown Marquette's biggest parking lots, but up until the late 1960s, it was actually one of downtown Marquette's busiest corners. The Green and Ida blocks combined for quite the imposing sight on the corner, while sitting right next to that complex was St. John's Church. The Green Block was built in the 1890s as a hotel, but quickly transitioned into an apartment building with stores on street level. The most famous tenant? Craig's News, which operated from the 1930s to the 1960s, when Earl and Jerry Craig sold it to another Marquette business icon, Joe Fine, who was growing bored in retirement after selling his iconic namesake tavern. The whole building itself was torn down in 1967 to make way for parking for St. John's Church next door. The French Catholic Church, as it was known, was originally constructed in 1855, just 6 years after the city's founding. St. John's was then rebuilt as the first big cement block building in the city in 1906, and for the next 80 years it served parishioners with a floor and a balcony that combined could hold almost 1,000 people. Structural problems, along with the fact that St. Peter's Cathedral was just 2.5 blocks away, led the Diocese of Marquette to announce its closure in June of 1986. Despite public uproar and many attempts to save the building, it met its fate in December of that year, being torn down for parking. Part of the structure still remains, though, as its old convent, complete with bell tower, is still being used as an office complex. The other lost building that once sat in that giant parking lot was Liberty Hall. It was constructed in 1911 by the Liberty Hall Association and was intended to be a gathering place for Marquette residents of Finnish descent. It had a small theater where touring theatrical companies would perform. It had its own Finnish language library, and for a short time it even had its own house orchestra that would not only play for association members, but would also be available when community residents would rent the hall for wedding receptions and public gatherings. Unlike many downtown buildings, some still going 130 years after they were built, Liberty Hall didn't last long. A combination of the Depression-era economy and the need for space for a newly developing industry meant that just 27 years after it was constructed, Liberty Hall was torn down, marked by a grand celebration to thank the community. On the land where it once stood, a gas station of one brand or another has been operating since 1939. If you head up 3rd Street and look at the post office, you can tell how the building itself has expanded over the years. And with those expansions and the need for more parking, several buildings that used to be behind the post office are now gone, perhaps the most famous of those being the old Marquette Bottling Works plant. From 1887 to the early 1960s, this is where the area's supply of Pepsi, Orange Crush and other related soft drinks came from. However, changes in how pop was bottled, plus the expansion of the post office building, led to that structure being torn down in 1964. Just around the corner from the old Marquette bottling plant sits the 100 West block of Bluff Street. On the south side of the street, which is now home to the upper level of the main downtown parking deck, once sat a group of houses. After the street became commercialized in the early part of the 20th century, some of those houses were torn down for parking areas for Washington Street department stores, but a few remained, including one that served as the home of the Upper Peninsula Beauty Academy. From 1950 through the early 1980s, the building taught aspiring hairdressers and cosmetologists from across the UP. It was the last remaining structure on the south side of that block to be removed when the parking deck was built in the 1990s. Across the street from where the UP Beauty Academy once stood now sits another parking lot, but for 70 years that space was home to one of the most impressive old sandstone structures in Marquette, the Ely School. Named after Heman Ely, who was one of the developers of the rail system in the UP, the school was built in 1890 during the first wave of school expansion in Marquette. When the next wave rolled around in the late 1920s, the structure, which some had already considered outdated, was sold to the Catholic Diocese of Marquette and renamed the St. John's School. Students from that church attended classes there for the next 4 decades. By the 1960s, the building was indeed starting to show its age, and the then Michigan Bell building next door was expanding and in need of parking for its growing group of employees. So, under the guise of urban renewal, the Sandstone building was demolished in 1971, and the parking lot that was built in its place still stands. If you head down Bluff, just across Front Street, you'll see another set of parking lots, including one that makes up the corner of Bluff and Blaker. In that exact spot once sat this private home, a building that in the first half of the 20th century became the Oates Funeral Home. It also led a very interesting life during and after World War II as the Veterans Service Center, which housed groups such as the USO and other military organizations. Like many of the classic first or second generation Marquette structures, it too was torn down in the late 1960s to make room for the parking lot that's still there. Up on Ridge Street sits the big and very well used parking lot for the Peter White Public Library. That particular space has led several different lives, perhaps most importantly as the first home of St. Luke's Hospital. The facility, which was one of Marquette's first public hospitals, began life on Ridge Street before outgrowing the small structure. In the 1930s, construction began on a new medical campus near Northern Michigan College. In the 1970s, St. Luke's merged with St. Mary's to become Marquette General, thereby becoming Marquette's major medical care facility. The hospital was purchased by Duke LifePoint in the 2010s, who opened a brand new facility in the heart of Marquette in 2017. Across the street from the library parking lot sits a private parking lot, a space that at one time was the location of the first home of the Messiah Lutheran Church. Constructed in 1883 as the Swedish Evangelical Messiah Lutheran Church, it had a 70-foot tower that was visible from many vantage points throughout the city. As the church's congregation grew, the need for a bigger facility meant a move to the corner of Magnetic and 4th in 1960. The old church was then torn down for a parking lot in 1965. The greatest concentration of parking lots, though, sit in several areas of downtown south of Washington Street. Some streets, in fact, have become more parking lot than buildings, including Spring Street. That street, because of its proximity to the train station, was once vastly different as it was home to 4 different hotels. This parking lot was the home of the Windsor Hotel, in business from 1891 to 1915, while right across the street sat the Brunswick Hotel. That structure was built in the late 1880s and was still standing 8 decades later, mostly as a home for transients and retired railroad workers. After a series series of fires, the Brunswick was torn down in the late 1960s, eventually ending up as a parking area for the Kendricks Bordeaux law firm. One other current parking lot on Spring Street housed not a hotel, but was the site of Marquette Fire Station Number 1. After the Great Fire of 1868, city leaders, not wanting a repeat of the tragedy, decided that Marquette needed a fire department. So pumps were bought, firefighters hired, and Marquette's first fire station was constructed. A bell tower topped the building, and the bell it contained would ring to summon firefighters every time a blaze broke out. By 1900, the station was home to Marquette's fire chief, assistant chief, 3 drivers, and 22 men, along with 2 carts, 1 hook and ladder truck, and 1 wagon. As the city grew, Fire Hall Number 2 was built on Front Street in 1913, and by the 1960s, it became apparent that Marquette's original fire hall, by then nearly a century old, was in need of replacement. That occurred in the early 1970s when the city's newest fire hall was built a block and a half away on South 3rd Street. Ironically, it was built on the site of a commercial block that had just burned down a short time earlier, a fire that killed 2 people and caused so much damage to a restaurant that had just opened in that building, the Villa Capri, that the villa had to move from downtown to the city's west side, where it became a Marquette institution for over half a century. The original Fire Hall Number 1 was then torn down for parking. The bell from that original fire station now sits in the Firefighters Memorial at Marquette's Elwood Matson Lower Harbor Park. Just north of Spring Street sits Main Street, a 1-block boulevard known mostly as the site of Marquette's old passenger train station. While the north side of the street is now mostly a city parking lot, there was a business that called that land home for almost 80 years, the Marquette Steam Laundry. Started in the 1880s by brothers Fred and Frank Needham, it grew into one of Marquette's bigger businesses by the 1920s, serving not only residential customers but industrial clients as well. Hotels, manufacturing companies, and even local jails would send their work clothes and bedding out to the Marquette Steam Laundry to get cleaned. The company employed a fleet of trucks and drivers to pick up dirty clothes and linens and bring them back to their owners clean. During its peak years, the laundry was one of downtown Marquette's biggest employers with over 40 individuals on its payroll. However, the post-World War II rise in devices like home washing machines cut into the steam laundry's business, and it closed in 1960. The building was then torn down, replaced by a bowling alley, which itself was demolished in the early 1990s, leaving the space for what is now called the Main Street parking lot. Just a few feet away from where the Marquette Steam Laundry once sat was one of Marquette's most unique old buildings. In the 1920s, the Marquette Light and Power Department built a small, narrow structure right in the middle of the 100 block of East Main Street to replace a storefront office they had had up the street on Front. When the Marquette Chamber of Commerce was founded in 1930, they purchased that building, which they used as their office for the next 3 decades. From there, they provided information to tourists, bathrooms to the public, and even a credit reporting bureau in the back of the office. In the late 1950s, they outgrew that structure and moved to new offices in Lakeside Park. The building in the middle of the street was then torn down to allow for parking spots to be painted in on either side of that street. Finally, the 2 blocks just to the south of that legendary building in the middle of the street are now mostly parking lots, but for the first 100 or so years of Marquette history were actually one of the most vibrant parts of downtown. On the east side of the 200 block sits this parking lot, which at one time housed 4 different buildings, including the homes of places like Quality Hardware, Stingline Printing, and perhaps most infamously, Andy's Bar. The buildings were torn down one by one starting in the 1960s, but were done so in a haphazard fashion, leaving evidence of what used to sit there for over a decade. The last of the 4, the building that housed Andy's, was torn down after the bar itself closed in the early 1980s. The west side of the 300 block, almost now entirely a parking lot, itself housed a vibrant group of businesses, including the first Sandstone home of the First National Bank, as well as some of the most famous restaurants and bars in Marquette history. The Bon-Ton, the Central Cafe, the Deluxe, and the Jet Grill all sat next to each other on this stretch of street, as did longtime Marquette businesses like Kelly's Hardware. But the urban renewal rage of the late 1960s caused most of the structures to be torn down within a 5-year span, to be replaced by the Christine Van Abel building, which houses an insurance company, and a parking lot that takes up the vast majority of that block. So the next time you're driving into downtown Marquette to eat or to shop, and you find a lot in which you can park, take a second to appreciate what came before. And although the context isn't quite the same, let the words of a great Canadian philosopher ring through your head. They paved paradise and put up a parking lot.